Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong says inherent fault lines in the country's diverse society must be watched carefully and handled properly, even as the country recognises and accepts its differences. He adds that the Internal Security Department, or ISD, plays a key role in tackling such challenges. Mr. Lee was speaking at the intelligence agency's 75th anniversary. Jeraldine Yap with more.
From the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas to the tensions between the United States and China, these geopolitical issues have triggered a variety of reactions in Singapore. Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong says differences in perspectives and attitudes haven't disappeared, even though Singapore has come a long way in building trust between different communities.
All these differences are a reality that we must recognize and accept. They remind us to continue watching racial and religious relations carefully, because misunderstandings and frictions can still arise and cause serious problems if not properly handled.
Mr. Lee adds that Singapore also has to watch out for emerging social divisions, such as simmering tensions between citizens and non-Singaporeans living and working here, as well as sharpening polarization between groups championing different causes. Meanwhile, the dangers of foreign influence and terrorism remain. The threat from transnational Islamist terrorist groups has evolved. New forms of extremist ideologies are also emerging, with Singapore seeing its first case of far-right radicalization in 2020.
We take this danger seriously because a single act of terror could tear apart the racial and religious harmony and trust that we have painstakingly built over decades. We've seen this happen too often in other countries, and this is where ISD comes in, to make sure our people do not get captured by some extreme ideology or caught up in quarrels which are not ours to sow chaos within our own community.
Mr. Lee says ISD officers are the eyes and ears on the ground, keeping close watch on trends and nipping problems in the bud before they get out of hand.
It's not by chance that Singapore has succeeded in mitigating and neutralizing security threats to domestic security and to sovereignty all this while. From its post-war roots till today, ISD has been the steady force at our front lines.
The ISD's work is veiled in secrecy for operational security, but it's beginning to tell its story in a museum display and at job fairs. Mr. Lee says this will attract a new generation of officers and help the ISD be the first-class intelligence agency that Singapore needs.
For more, we're joined by geopolitical risk analyst Dr. Shashi Jayakumar. Dr. Jayakumar, now, PM Lee, differences are a reality that we must recognize and accept. In terms of implementing that, actually living that, from policymakers on the one end of the spectrum to those of us who are living, embracing that difference in our lives, what does each side need to be doing?
No, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. I would say this. It's been known for some considerable amount of time, the government entities, agencies and organizations which are in charge of the effort to bridge our differences. There's good work done by the ministries, MCCY, PA, also the interreligious organization, which has been around for a long time, what used to be the ILCCs, and the community engagement program. There's so many. The issue I would have is that there are younger people, I regularly come into contact with them, who are experiential, aspirational. They hear about these threats, differences, extremism, disinformation, and they want to know what to do about it. From time to time, and I think this is a positive set of developments, they also come up with they form these little NGOs or CSOs. They get together and they talk about issues. So from my point of view, the top-level governmental-led apparatus, I think, can and must remain. That must remain primary. But it's not really, when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, when you don't talk about sensitive issues, race, language, religion, and so on and so forth, because these might be part of OB markers, right? I think for many of these issues, particularly given social media, people are talking, we have to accept their right to talk. It's more the issue of them not inhabiting that polarized space of echo chambers, given social media. It's more the channeling of energies in positive directions.
Okay,
and
so
I think the future is there.
Let me pick it up because you mentioned a couple of things. As ISD scans the horizons, right? You've got terrorism, you've got foreign interference, domestic vulnerabilities.
That's right.
Explain to us why you feel it's not so much about which of these three, as you slice it, is more important, but how they interplay with each other in this space quite critically.
Thank you. When it comes to terrorism, I will share with you candidly, I'm actually concerned. When I meet young people, they don't remember 9/11, and that's the same year, 2001, as the JI. People forget the Twin Towers, and they tell me, what's this thing about the towers? And with JI, they're like, what's that? People forget, notwithstanding efforts by the authorities to remind us that actually tragedy was narrowly averted here for a variety of reasons. Good work, unsung work by the security agencies, including ISD, but also information shared with us. There was a little bit of serendipity as well. People forget that after JI, there were self-radicalized individuals, and I think the assumption has been made by many that after the fall of ISIS on the battlefield, but not in the mind, that's game over. You can go and reinvent yourself, be some other sort of security professional. But look at the ISD threat assessment reports, which are issued. There was one this year, which shows correctly, of course, the data that there's continued to be a trickle of radicalized individuals in Singapore, and there's a right-wing individual as well. New forms and new wrinkles of radicalization. But that said, radicalized individuals, if you go upstream, not yet violent extremists, but they're inhabiting the polarized stakes, that itself, even though many will never tip into the violent bucket, is very, very concerning. Because you look at this hollowing out of the middle ground you see in various parts of the West, that slowly and surely is coming into Asia, and by implication, my analysis into Singapore as well. You can't de-radicalize these people. If you tell them you're extremists, they'll be very, very offended. They see themselves as at the vanguard of change, positive change. Just stop oil, extinction rebellion, and so on and so forth. Yeah. I think rather than de-radicalizing them, finding ways to bridge differences, to bridge the discord, finding a common ground, which is not social media counter-narrative, talking, the hard yards of talking. You recall discourse. So rebuilding the town square. I'm not trying to glorify the old days, but the ability to bridge divides and differences, notwithstanding the fact that we are polyglot, is going to be absolutely critical for our future. And that can't be top down alone.
Yeah. You talk about people forgetting. No, in the 19 days now of conflict in the Middle East. So I was taking a look online because we have guests coming to discuss this. And the problem is, say if you've forgotten about the Twin Towers, what you see online about it now, certainly on social media, is not edifying and certainly not helping what you say, this hollowed out discourse, this absence of a middle ground on how to talk about, for example, people who really ought to know better, comparing Hamas is exactly the same as ISIS or IS. It is not the same. You may dislike them for your own reasons, but it is not a good idea to lump them, to equate one to the other. You want people not to forget, but how we're being reminded now may not be helpful, especially on social media.
I think so, and compounded by the fact, particularly on two of the great conflicts currently ongoing, Israel, Palestine, and Hamas, and the Ukraine conflict, which seems to have receded somewhat because of Hamas, Israel, Ukraine. There's a tremendous amount of disinformation floating around, some of which I would calculate is state-sponsored subversion, some of which is not. It's just organic, it is concocted. And it plays around in these short TikTok kind of videos in a manner which is supremely influential on the younger generation. We have to accept there's no silver bullet for this, but we also have to accept that in terms of the hard yards being done by, in my view, government agencies, good moves being made, let's say, by the education ministry in terms of critical thinking, social media hygiene, cyber hygiene, nurturing an informed younger generation of people who are going to be our future is going to be very, very important. And that feeds into constructive discourse. I think that's going to be tremendously important.
So the final question we have time for is, you talked about these advocacy groups, these pressure pressure group tactics sometimes, you know, championing various causes, NGOs and things like that. How dangerous are they really, in the first question, and what's the impact on our national security? And how do you see that rebuilding the town hall situation that you talked about feeding into this?
On the town hall, there have been various initiatives. Forward Singapore was one, but even way back, our Singapore conversation, which were constructed for different reasons. But I know I've talked to, interviewed the people who are responsible for it. And the sheer fact that I'm Singaporean, young, old, Indian, Chinese, different languages, you're in the room, and this person's view seems to be completely different, but you leave not necessarily agreeing, but a process has been set in motion. There's academic literature on this, intergroup, intra-group contact. Foreign interference, you can't grasp it like terrorism. You can't de-radicalize people. You can't count the numbers of casualties. It's much more nebulous, and therefore, you get the sense that this process of education from the ground up, rather than openly calling out the group. You can do that for terrorism. You can't do that for subversion, interference. So therefore, we're stuck in a very difficult place. I don't mean to be a glass half empty kind of person, but as I pointed out, there are green shoots that we can look to.
All right. Well, we'll leave it on that positive note, shall we? Many thanks for your thoughts there. Speaking with Dr. Shashi Jayakumar. He's a geopolitical risk analyst. Thanks very much.